The sound of the slap echoed across the bright dining room so violently that every fork stopped moving. My 5-month-old son jerked awake against my chest, his tiny body trembling as he burst into terrified tears. My cheek burned with a pain that wasn't nearly as unbearable as the silence that followed. My mother-in-law stood in front of me with fury blazing in her eyes, as if striking a woman holding an infant was the most natural thing in the world. The only reason she had hit me was because lunch had been served 3 minutes later than she demanded. My hands instinctively wrapped tighter around my baby, protecting his fragile head while my own heart shattered into pieces. I turned toward my husband, desperate to see outrage, protection, or even disbelief. Instead, he slowly looked away, sighed with annoyance, and told me I should have apologized sooner because his mother hated waiting. In that single moment, I realized I wasn't losing an argument. I was losing the family I had sacrificed everything to build. Before we continue this emotional journey, if you believe kindness is stronger than cruelty, forgiveness is more powerful than revenge, and everyone deserves hope and second chances, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who believes in compassion, and subscribe to our channel. Every bit of support helps our community continue sharing stories that remind us all that even the darkest days can lead to brighter tomorrows. My name is Meredith, and until that afternoon, I had convinced myself that love required endurance. I believed marriages survived difficult seasons because people fought through them together. I believed respect could eventually grow inside a family that had never accepted me. Looking back, I understand that I confused patience with surrender. I mistook silence for peace, and I called emotional neglect a temporary problem when it had already become my daily reality. I had met my husband, Grant, during a volunteer fundraiser at a local animal shelter outside Portland. He wasn't the loudest person in the room, but he was dependable, calm, and incredibly thoughtful. While others socialized, he quietly repaired broken fencing and carried heavy supplies without expecting praise. Those small acts of kindness drew me toward him. We spent months discovering shared dreams about raising children, traveling through national parks, and creating a home filled with laughter instead of conflict. When he proposed beneath a field of blooming wildflowers, I genuinely believed I had found the safest place my heart would ever know. The only shadow over our engagement came from his mother, Lorraine. From our very first meeting, she evaluated me the way someone inspected an object before deciding whether it deserved a place in the house. Nothing escaped her criticism. My smile looked rehearsed. My clothes were too casual. My career as a pediatric occupational therapist wasn't prestigious enough. Even the homemade pie I proudly brought to dinner became evidence that I lacked sophistication because, according to her, educated women didn't spend time baking. Grant always brushed it aside. He insisted that his mother simply had a strong personality. He promised she would soften once she saw how happy we made each other. Every time she crossed another boundary, he asked me for one more chance. One more holiday. One more family dinner. One more birthday. One more weekend visit. Those one more chances quietly became years. After our wedding, everything changed faster than I expected. Grant's father suffered a stroke that limited his mobility, and Lorraine convinced Grant that the responsible thing would be for us to move into their large suburban home temporarily while helping with caregiving. Temporary sounded manageable. 6 months seemed like a reasonable sacrifice for family. 6 months quietly became almost 3 years. At first, I truly tried. I cooked meals before leaving for work. I cleaned shared spaces every evening. I organized medication schedules for Grant's father, drove him to appointments, and even rearranged my work hours to make everyone's lives easier. His father, Arthur, appreciated everything I did. He thanked me constantly and often apologized for the tension his illness had unintentionally created. Lorraine, however, saw kindness as weakness. Every helpful act simply raised her expectations. If breakfast appeared at 8 o'clock, she wanted it at 7:30 the following morning. If I folded laundry, she criticized the way towels were stacked. If I vacuumed, she pointed out imaginary dust beneath furniture. If I purchased groceries, she complained about brands. Nothing earned appreciation because appreciation would have required admitting that I contributed something valuable. Grant noticed every criticism. He simply chose not to respond. His explanation rarely changed. He believed confronting his mother would create unnecessary stress while his father recovered. So I remained quiet. When I became pregnant with our son, I hoped everything would finally improve. Pregnancy has a remarkable way of making people imagine new beginnings. I pictured grandparents falling in love with their grandson. I imagined family photographs full of genuine smiles. I believed a tiny baby might heal wounds adults had failed to mend. Instead, Lorraine became even more controlling. She criticized my weight regardless of whether I gained or lost pounds. She questioned every doctor's recommendation. She insisted women in her generation worked until delivery without complaining. When morning sickness left me dehydrated, she accused me of exaggerating. When swollen ankles made walking painful, she suggested I lacked resilience. Grant still avoided conflict. He would comfort me privately after every incident, but never once challenged her in front of anyone. That pattern quietly taught Lorraine she could continue. The day our son, Rowan, entered the world became the happiest moment of my life. Holding him against my chest erased months of fear. His tiny fingers wrapped around mine with surprising strength, and for the first time in years, I felt genuinely needed in a way that wasn't based on endless service. Arthur cried when he first held his grandson. Even Lorraine smiled. For exactly 2 days. Then she began treating Rowan as though he belonged to everyone except me. She criticized breastfeeding. She criticized bottle feeding. She criticized how long I rocked him. She criticized how often I picked him up. If Rowan cried, it became proof I wasn't experienced enough. If he slept peacefully, it became evidence she had tired him out by holding him correctly earlier that day. Every accomplishment somehow belonged to her. Every problem belonged to me. Sleep deprivation slowly made everything worse. Like most newborns, Rowan rarely slept for long stretches. I functioned on broken naps while still managing laundry, meals, pediatric appointments, household cleaning, and caring for Arthur whenever Grant worked late. No matter how exhausted I became, Lorraine insisted motherhood wasn't difficult because women had done it for centuries. One warm Saturday afternoon, relatives gathered for Arthur's 72nd birthday. The house filled with cousins, neighbors, longtime family friends, and children laughing in the backyard beneath bright summer sunshine. I woke before sunrise preparing food. I baked desserts. Decorated tables. Wrapped gifts. Fed Rowan. Changed diapers. Helped Arthur dress. By noon, I had barely sat down once. Just as everyone prepared to eat, Rowan suddenly became fussy. His tiny face turned red, and I recognized the signs immediately. He needed feeding. Instead of rushing through it, I carried him upstairs to the quiet nursery, settled into the rocking chair beside the sunny window, and fed him slowly while humming the lullaby my own grandmother used to sing. His breathing gradually slowed. His tiny hand rested against my heart. Those peaceful minutes reminded me why every sacrifice felt worthwhile. When we finally returned downstairs, exactly 3 minutes had passed beyond Lorraine's planned serving time. 3 minutes. She looked at the untouched dishes before staring directly at me. The room became unnaturally quiet. Without warning, she marched across the dining room and slapped me across the face with enough force to nearly knock me sideways. Because Rowan was strapped securely against my chest inside his baby carrier, I twisted instinctively rather than falling directly onto him. Gasps filled the room. Someone dropped a glass. Arthur tried standing too quickly and nearly lost balance. Rowan screamed louder than I had ever heard. My cheek burned intensely. But nothing hurt more than watching Grant remain seated. He slowly stood, not to comfort me, but to sigh in frustration. He rubbed his forehead as though I had created an inconvenience. Then, in front of every guest, he quietly said that if I had respected his mother's schedule, none of this would have happened. Those words crushed something inside me that would never be repaired. No bruise lasts forever. Betrayal does. I looked around the room searching for someone, anyone, to tell me this wasn't normal. Most people stared at their plates. Some looked horrified. Others looked embarrassed. No one moved. No one spoke. Arthur's eyes filled with tears. He whispered that this had gone too far. Lorraine ignored him completely. She calmly adjusted a serving spoon and announced that lunch was getting cold. As if striking the mother of her grandson had merely been another household chore. I gently unfastened Rowan's carrier, cradled him against my shoulder, kissed his damp forehead, and realized something with startling clarity. I could survive disrespect aimed at me. I could survive insults. I could survive criticism. But I would never allow my son to grow up believing this was what family looked like. That afternoon, while everyone forced awkward smiles over birthday cake, I quietly began planning an exit no one would see coming. The woman who entered that dining room believed love meant staying no matter how much it hurt. The woman who carried her baby back upstairs understood that sometimes the greatest act of love is finding the courage to leave. The following morning arrived with brilliant sunshine spilling through the nursery window, but inside me, something had changed forever. My cheek still carried the faint outline of Lorraine's hand, yet the deeper wound was invisible. Rowan smiled at me as I lifted him from his crib, unaware that his tiny laugh had become the strongest reason I had ever found to stop accepting a life built on fear. As I held him close, I quietly promised that he would never grow up believing love meant enduring humiliation or that silence was the price of belonging. That promise became the beginning of everything that followed. The house behaved as though nothing unusual had happened. Lorraine criticized the way I prepared breakfast, humming cheerfully while rearranging dishes as if she had never struck me. Grant sat reading emails, avoiding eye contact whenever I entered the room. The previous day's violence had already become an inconvenience everyone expected me to forget. Arthur was the only person who looked unable to hide his shame. His trembling hands rested around a coffee mug he barely touched, and every time our eyes met, he looked like a man carrying a burden he wished he had lifted years earlier. After breakfast, Arthur quietly asked whether I could help him organize some old paperwork in his study. Lorraine dismissed it without interest, assuming it was another excuse for me to complete more chores. As soon as the study door closed, Arthur's composure crumbled. Tears gathered in his tired eyes before he apologized over and over for what had happened. He admitted he had watched Lorraine control every member of the family for decades. Friends disappeared because they refused to tolerate her behavior. Grant's younger sister had moved across the country years earlier and rarely visited because she could no longer endure her mother's emotional manipulation. Arthur confessed that he had always convinced himself keeping peace was better than creating conflict. Looking at Rowan sleeping peacefully in my arms, he whispered that his silence had helped create the woman Lorraine had become. Those words stayed with me. Silence protects the person causing harm, never the person suffering it. Arthur gently reached into a desk drawer and handed me a small envelope. Inside was a duplicate key to a safety deposit box and a handwritten note explaining that if I ever decided to leave, important family documents proving certain financial arrangements were stored there. He told me Lorraine controlled nearly every account in the household, including several that legally belonged to Grant but were managed through complicated paperwork she insisted upon years earlier. Arthur feared that if I ever tried to leave, Lorraine would use money as another weapon. I hugged him carefully, knowing he had spent decades trapped by the same fear I was only beginning to understand. Instead of confronting anyone, I became strangely calm. For the next several weeks, I smiled politely, completed my responsibilities, cared for Rowan, and quietly built a future nobody suspected. During Rowan's naps, I updated my professional certifications online. I contacted my former supervisor at the pediatric rehabilitation clinic where I had worked before maternity leave. To my surprise, she remembered me warmly and immediately offered flexible hours once I was ready to return. She even mentioned that one of the therapists had recently relocated, leaving an unexpected opening. For the first time in months, hope felt practical instead of imaginary. I opened a private bank account using money I had saved years before marriage. Each paycheck from freelance telehealth consultations went directly into that account. I sold a few pieces of jewelry I rarely wore, not because I desperately needed the money, but because every small step reminded me that independence grows through consistent decisions rather than dramatic moments. Grant noticed none of it. He continued living exactly as before. Whenever we were alone, he behaved like an affectionate husband. He kissed Rowan's forehead, asked about diaper changes, and occasionally apologized in vague, harmless sentences that never acknowledged what truly happened. He never once said the words I desperately needed. My mother was wrong. Instead, he repeated the familiar excuse. You know how she is. Eventually, those words lost all meaning. People don't simply become that way. Others allow them to remain that way. One bright afternoon, about 3 weeks after the slap, Grant surprised me with lunch at a nearby park while Arthur watched Rowan for an hour. We sat beneath tall maple trees as children played on swings nearby. For a brief moment, I almost believed we could repair everything. He smiled the way he had years earlier when we first met. He reached across the picnic table and held my hand. Then he asked if I could apologize to his mother. I thought I had misunderstood. He explained that Lorraine still felt embarrassed because several relatives believed she had overreacted. If I simply admitted I should have served lunch sooner, everyone could move forward peacefully. I stared at him in complete disbelief. He wasn't asking his mother to apologize for hitting the woman holding his infant son. He wanted me to apologize for being assaulted. The realization settled over me with frightening clarity. Grant didn't merely fear disappointing his mother. He expected me to absorb every injustice so he never had to challenge her. That afternoon ended any remaining hope I had for our marriage. When we returned home, I stopped trying to save something I now understood had never truly existed. Over the following month, quiet changes continued. I found a small apartment near the rehabilitation clinic with large windows overlooking a public garden. It wasn't luxurious, but sunlight poured into every room, and the nearby playground would one day become Rowan's favorite place. I signed the lease without telling anyone. I purchased secondhand furniture piece by piece. A crib. A rocking chair. A dining table with only 2 chairs. Every item represented freedom instead of status. Arthur secretly helped whenever he safely could. One afternoon he quietly handed me several old family photo albums. He told me Rowan deserved pictures of the grandfather who loved him without conditions. I cried the entire drive home. Not because I was afraid anymore. Because kindness still existed inside that complicated family. As summer slowly turned toward early autumn, Lorraine's behavior grew even harsher. She seemed irritated that I no longer reacted emotionally to criticism. When insults failed to provoke tears, she invented new reasons to complain. She criticized the clothes I dressed Rowan in, accused me of wasting electricity, questioned every grocery purchase, and even inspected the nursery after I cleaned it. Nothing satisfied her. She wanted control more than obedience. One Saturday morning, relatives gathered again for a small family brunch celebrating a cousin's engagement. Sunlight streamed through every window as conversations filled the house. Lorraine proudly entertained guests while Grant grilled food outside. Halfway through the afternoon, Rowan began fussing. I carried him upstairs to change his diaper. When I returned, I discovered Lorraine holding him. Without asking. Without permission. She proudly walked through the crowded living room introducing him as her baby. I politely reached forward to take him back. She stepped away. Smiling. Several guests laughed awkwardly, assuming it was harmless teasing. Then Rowan began crying. He stretched both tiny arms toward me. Every instinct inside me screamed to comfort him. Again I reached forward. Again Lorraine refused. Something inside me finally broke. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Calmly. I looked directly at her and, for the first time in years, spoke firmly enough for everyone nearby to hear. I told her Rowan was my son, not hers, and that if she ever refused to return him to me again, I would immediately leave with him and never come back. The room fell silent. Lorraine laughed. She believed I was bluffing. Grant hurried inside after hearing raised voices and immediately asked what I had done this time. Not what his mother had done. What I had done. That single sentence erased every remaining doubt. I walked upstairs, packed Rowan's diaper bag, gathered the envelope Arthur had given me weeks earlier, picked up the small suitcase I had secretly prepared, and carried my son downstairs. Nobody realized what was happening until I reached the front door. Grant called after me. Lorraine ordered me to stop. Arthur quietly stood beside the hallway wall with tears in his eyes. As I reached the doorway, he gave me the smallest nod. Not permission. Support. I opened the front door. Warm afternoon sunlight flooded the entrance. For the first time in years, breathing felt effortless. Grant finally caught up with me on the driveway. He asked where I thought I was going. I looked at him calmly and answered with the truth he should have heard long ago. I wasn't leaving because his mother slapped me. I was leaving because he watched her do it, and decided I deserved it. Those words hit him harder than any argument ever could. His face lost all color. For the first time since our marriage began, he had no excuse left to hide behind. Without another word, I placed Rowan safely into his car seat, closed the door, started the engine, and drove toward a future that still frightened me, but no longer trapped me. Behind me, in the rearview mirror, the house grew smaller with every passing mile. So did the power it had held over my life. Driving away felt nothing like victory. Movies often make freedom look dramatic, but real freedom is quieter. It sounds like a baby sleeping peacefully in the back seat after weeks of sensing his mother's anxiety. It feels like trembling hands gripping the steering wheel because the future is uncertain, yet somehow less frightening than the past. As I glanced into the rearview mirror, Rowan had fallen asleep with one tiny hand resting beside his cheek. The afternoon sunlight danced across his blanket, and for the first time since he was born, I realized he wasn't simply depending on me for food and comfort. He was depending on me to teach him what love should never look like. The apartment welcomed us with silence instead of criticism. There were no footsteps rushing toward me to inspect my parenting. No voice waiting to point out imaginary mistakes. No tension hanging in the air. It wasn't perfect. There were unopened boxes stacked against walls, inexpensive furniture, and only a handful of decorations. But every inch of that little home belonged to peace. I laid Rowan in his new crib beside the sunny window, watched him stretch happily, and cried tears that carried months of fear away. Those weren't tears of weakness anymore. They were tears of relief. Returning to work a few weeks later wasn't easy, but it reminded me of the woman I had been before losing myself inside someone else's expectations. The rehabilitation clinic welcomed me warmly. Families remembered me. Children I had once treated excitedly ran toward me with smiles that reached their eyes. Every encouraging word rebuilt a piece of confidence Lorraine had spent years trying to destroy. My supervisor admired the strength it had taken to return while raising an infant alone and arranged flexible hours so I could always put Rowan first. Life slowly settled into a rhythm that felt healthy. Every morning sunlight poured through our kitchen window while I prepared breakfast with Rowan laughing in his high chair. We visited the park after work. We read books on the living room floor. Weekends became filled with simple moments instead of emotional survival. There were still difficult days. Money was tight. I often felt exhausted. Sometimes loneliness quietly appeared when Rowan fell asleep and the apartment became still. But loneliness was far kinder than living in a house full of people who made me feel invisible. About 2 months after I left, Grant finally asked to meet. He requested that we talk in a public botanical garden one warm afternoon while Rowan stayed with a trusted daycare caregiver for a couple of hours. I agreed because I believed every person deserved one honest conversation. When I arrived, Grant looked different. He had lost weight. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes. The confidence he once carried had disappeared. For several moments neither of us spoke. Finally, he admitted the house had changed after my departure. Not because Lorraine had become kinder. Because she no longer had me to blame. Every complaint she once directed toward me had shifted onto him. Breakfast wasn't prepared correctly. Laundry wasn't folded properly. The house wasn't clean enough. He confessed that for the first time in his life, he experienced the constant criticism I had endured for years. He apologized. Not with excuses. Not with explanations. Not by blaming stress or family pressure. He simply admitted he had failed as a husband and as a father. Listening to him, I saw genuine regret. But regret and trust are not the same thing. I thanked him for finally telling the truth. Then I explained something he needed to understand. The slap hadn't ended our marriage. His silence had. Every day afterward, he had chosen comfort over courage. He had protected the person causing harm instead of protecting his own family. Those choices could not simply disappear because he finally understood their consequences. Grant cried. It was the first time I had ever seen him allow himself to break. He admitted he had spent his entire childhood trying to avoid upsetting his mother. Pleasing her had become second nature. Standing against her felt impossible until losing me forced him to see what his fear had cost. I believed his pain. I also knew pain alone doesn't erase the damage already done. Before we left, I made one request. If he wanted to become part of Rowan's life again, he needed to build a relationship based on consistency, respect, and accountability, not promises. He agreed. The following week surprised me. Grant rented a small apartment of his own. He moved out of his parents' house. He began attending counseling. He never pressured me to return. Instead, he focused entirely on becoming a better father. He arrived on time for every supervised visit. He learned Rowan's feeding schedule. He changed diapers without complaint. He read picture books with excitement. For the first time, I saw the father I had always hoped Rowan would have. Meanwhile, Lorraine refused to accept reality. She called repeatedly. She left angry messages accusing me of destroying her family. When those failed, she attempted guilt. When guilt failed, she demanded. Eventually, legal boundaries became necessary. Receiving formal notice that all communication had to remain respectful and limited through attorneys shocked her more than anything else ever had. For the first time in decades, nobody surrendered to her anger. Arthur visited us one beautiful autumn afternoon. Rowan immediately crawled toward him, laughing with pure delight. Arthur smiled through tears as he held his grandson beneath colorful maple trees outside the apartment building. He confessed that after Grant moved out, he finally found the courage to leave as well. He had rented a modest retirement cottage only 15 minutes away. For the first time in over 40 years, he said his home felt peaceful. Watching that gentle man rediscover happiness reminded me that it is never too late to choose a healthier life. Months passed. Winter arrived, then spring. Rowan celebrated his first birthday surrounded by people who genuinely loved him. There were balloons tied to chairs. Homemade cupcakes covered with colorful frosting. Children laughing in the sunshine. Friends from work. Neighbors. Arthur. Grant. Everyone smiled because they wanted to be there, not because they were pretending. As I watched Rowan smash birthday cake with both hands, I realized something remarkable. Not one person raised their voice. Not one person criticized another. Love filled the room naturally. That was the family I wanted my son to remember. Nearly a year after I left, Grant asked if we could take a walk after Rowan's birthday party. The afternoon was warm, and flowers lined the walking path through the park. He thanked me. Not for forgiving him. Not for giving him another chance to be Rowan's father. He thanked me for leaving. He admitted that if I had stayed, he probably would have continued making excuses forever. Losing us forced him to become the man he should have been from the beginning. I smiled sadly. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is allowing them to face the consequences of their own choices. Whether our marriage could ever be rebuilt wasn't the most important question anymore. Healing was. Respect was. Our son's future was. Only time could decide the rest. As for Lorraine, life eventually taught her lessons no one else could. Relatives who had witnessed that terrible afternoon slowly distanced themselves. People she once controlled stopped accepting her behavior. The reputation she had spent decades protecting quietly unraveled, not because anyone sought revenge, but because the truth has a way of revealing itself over time. I never celebrated her loneliness. Bitterness would only have chained me to the past. Instead, I hoped that one day she would discover what genuine kindness looked like. Whether she ever changed was no longer my responsibility. One bright afternoon, nearly 2 years after everything happened, Rowan ran across the same botanical garden where Grant had once apologized. He laughed as butterflies fluttered around blooming flowers, his tiny shoes splashing through patches of sunlight beneath the trees. I watched him with tears of gratitude. Children learn what love looks like by watching the adults around them. Because I had walked away, my son would grow up believing that respect belongs in every relationship, that kindness is never weakness, and that courage sometimes means leaving the place you once called home. If you've made it this far, I'd love to hear from you. Please leave a meaningful comment and tell us this. What do you think hurts more, being betrayed by someone who harms you, or by the person who should have protected you? And if this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. As I held Rowan's little hand and watched him run fearlessly toward a future filled with laughter instead of fear, I finally understood that making someone regret hurting you isn't about revenge. It's about refusing to let their cruelty define the rest of your life. The greatest victory wasn't watching those who failed me face the consequences of their choices. The greatest victory was building a life where my son woke up every morning surrounded by peace, respect, and unconditional love. In the end, I didn't win because they lost. I won because I found the strength to choose hope over fear, dignity over silence, and a brighter tomorrow over a painful yesterday. And sometimes, that is the most powerful ending of all.